Mark Sloan is the founder and director of Curioso, an independent curatorial consultancy based in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Although his primary focus as a curator has been in the realm of national and international contemporary art, Sloan has had a sustained engagement with the American South, culminating in the exhibition Southbound, Photographs of and about the New South, which he co-curated with political geographer Mark Long. This project was the largest exhibition of photographs about the region ever produced and garnered regional, national, and international acclaim, including features in The Guardian and Time magazine. Funded with a major grant from the National Endowment for the Arts, the project featured 56 photographers showcasing their visions of the American South over the first decades of the 21st century. The photographs portray the South through many lenses, as a bastion of tradition, as a region remade through Americanization and globalization, and as a land full of surprising realities. Over the last 40-plus years, as a curator, photographer, writer, author, editor, and video producer, Sloan has built a prodigious body of work, drawing favorable reviews from the New York Times, Chicago Tribune, Washington Post, The Wall Street Journal, Garden & Gun, and Wired, as well as features on NPR's All Things Considered and Morning Edition. Born and raised in Selma, Alabama, Jerry Siegel has turned his eye to revealing the beauty in the people and places of the South. Siegel has photographed everything from beauty queens to drag queens, the kitchen junk drawer to Colin Powell, the school marching band to some of the South's most celebrated artists. Siegel manages to capture and highlight scenes that one could easily pass without a second glance, granting them a moment of importance and illuminating the beauty found in the ordinary. Siegel was awarded the grand prize at the first Artadia Awards in Atlanta in 2009. His first monograph, Facing South: Portraits of Southern Artists, was published in 2011 by the University of Alabama Press and features Siegel's portraits of 100 Southern artists. This body of work has been featured in solo exhibitions at 6 museums in Alabama, Georgia, and Louisiana. The collection has since grown to include more than 200 portraits, the most recent made this year. Siegel's second book, Black Belt Color, documents the unique cultural landscape of the South, concentrating on the internationally known yet chronically under-resourced Black Belt region of Alabama, where generations of his family were born and raised. Siegel's work featured in the touring photography exhibition Southbound, curated by Mark Sloan and organized by the Halsey Institute of Contemporary Art. His work is in collections including the Birmingham Museum of Art, the Do Good Fund, the Georgia Museum of Art, the High Museum of Art, the Jewel Collins Smith Museum, the Montgomery Museum of Fine Arts, the Morris Museum of Art, the Museum of Contemporary Art of Georgia, the Ogden Museum of Southern Art, the Telfair Museum, the Wiregrass Museum of Art, and many more. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Mark Sloan and Jerry Siegel.
Great. Thank you so much for the introductions there. And hi, Jerry. Good to see you.
Hey, Mark. Really good to see you.
So let's have a conversation in front of some people, but pretend like it's just you and me. What do you think?
That sounds great.
Yeah. So the topic is Southern photography, this oft photographed region, oft misunderstood,
Yes.
often stereotyped. And I think one of the things that characterizes your work, and certainly the work that's in the Southbound exhibition, is that it's such a stark contrast to the works that have historically come out of the South, or that have been promulgated out of the South, certainly beginning before the FSA, but the FSA sort of suck the oxygen out of the room there for a while and flooded the market with images of essentially downtrodden, primarily rural farm workers, sharecroppers. And that project, the FSA, was essentially a propaganda effort of the U.S. government started by the Department of Agriculture to provide visual proof that the government programs were working in these areas, and they often gave scripts to the photographers to go out and make photographs that basically tell the story that we want to have told, as opposed to the Jerry Siegel method, where you've been photographing in the South for 45 years and no one's given you a script, as far as I know.
No,
No.
that's correct.
And so there's a very different kind of image that comes out now, but it should be said, the elephant in the room is that the photographs that came out of the 30s and 40s of the American South have become emblematic and almost iconic about, and a sort of shorthand for what the South is and represents to a lot of people outside of the region. Kind of like the Andy Griffith show, people equated slow talking with slow thinking, you know.
Yeah.
So it's just kind of this, it became a stand-in, these images became a stand-in for what the South was, even though it was woefully inadequate and grossly stereotypic. But I do think that there have been a number of projects since then, and a number of photographers who have emerged, particularly in the 21st century, but quite a few in the late 20th century as well, who challenge this notion of what the South is, how it might be represented, its diversity, its the fact that it's urban, that it's high tech, that it's all different races and creeds and colors and socioeconomic levels, et cetera. So it's not really a one-dimensional thing. It's complicated. And so with that as a backdrop, I think one of the things that might be a fun way to kick off this conversation, Jerry, is to look at it through the lens of Jerry Siegel, who is someone who's had a catbird seat with the development of photography in the American South for the last 45 years. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you got started in photography and what were some of your first subjects.
I got started I was enamored with it by a friend who had a camera. And that was what initially brought me into it. And it was the traditional thing that a lot of people get into, shooting sunrises and sunsets and all their friends hanging out on the beach and having a good time. And I was convinced to go to a night class with a friend. And at the end of the class, they showed the work of a lot of the masters. I can't tell you who. The only one that stuck in my mind was Deanne Arbus. And that really set me on a course to be a photographer. I was not a good student, but that set me down the path of that's all I wanted to do. And it was primarily people. And I spent time, I was living in Mobile. My brother was in New Orleans. I was spending lots of time in the French Quarter and was just, you know, kind of responding to what I saw in front of me, but always looking mostly with the focus toward people and the people that were there.
Were you shooting 35 millimeter at that time?
I was.
Black and white, color?
All black and white. I always considered myself a black and white photographer. It really didn't change until the digital realm came in, and that kind of overlapped with the papers that I wanted to print on. There was Ectolure, there were Agfa Portriga, there were papers that I loved to print on that started disappearing. And I could no longer get what I wanted out of it at the same time that my commercial side of my business was asking me to turn things around quicker. So I got digital cameras, and that opened up a kind of a whole different realm where I could, you know, create, not depending on labs, not having my own dark room, and create exactly what I wanted. But previous to that, it was all 35 millimeter Hasselblads and Leicas and all film. And that was my focus.
Could we take a look at some of your early work? Do you have some of that you could share with us?
Okay.
Right. So where was this taken?
This was actually in Selma, right downtown, in front of Willie Witt's barbershop. And this lady came every weekend and sewed collards on the street. The one thing that I will say that's kind of an interesting, you know, I guess it's interesting to me, is how much things have changed when I was taking these pictures, and even a few years after this. I was just a kid with a camera, and photography wasn't in the daily conversation like it is now with cameras and phones and everything. And it was easy to approach people. Um, you're just a kid with a camera, and everybody was happy to talk to you. Now being at the age I am, it becomes a little bit hard. Everybody thinks I have an agenda, but I still try to get out and do it at every opportunity. It just takes a little bit more talking.
We'll get to that in a minute. I do love the fact that this has 2 telephone booths in it, so that
that kind of dates the timeline, doesn't it?
I mean, not just 1, but 2 next to each other. It's just so interesting. Those are like dinosaurs now. So, could we see some more?
Still in Selma. I think the early stuff I threw in here are actually all from Selma. This is right on Broad Street where all the Jewish merchants were. Not that these were the Jewish merchants, but they were out there selling their clocks. And, again, it was such a great time to be taking pictures, to be able to connect with people without being questioned. Just they were open to me and wanted to have a conversation.
And I will just point out, as if Jerry's not here, to the audience, that look at the beautiful compositional structure of this image. The use of shadow and light reminds me very much of Henri Cartier-Bresson, the French photographer, and his ability to capture that light and his subjects in such a way that he called it the decisive moment. And this image is really has a beautiful structure.
Thank you. This was went to see my uncle, and Elizabeth worked for him, and was struck by her dignity and how she carried herself, and the light was just beautiful coming in the window. I took this picture, and boy, this was like early 80s, 82, 83. And just a few years ago, my wife was working with Art Revive in Selma, and one of the other board members, they were on a trip together, and her daughter was on the trip. And she asked Patty, my wife, "Are you related to the Siegels in Houston Park?" And she said, "Yeah, that's our family." And it just so happened that I had sent this picture recently to Patty, so she had it on her phone and showed it to her. And her name is Elizabeth, but Elizabeth's daughter, well, I'm bad on name, just flew in my head, started crying and said, "That's exactly the way I remember my mom. I can't believe you have that picture."
That's great.
So it was a great moment. And those are the kind of things that I like so much about photography, but those moments where you connect with people like that on that level is really a special moment.
Mm-hmm. That's great.
I'll get into a little bit more where I
really, the biker series.
This is my biker series. Actually, there is a picture of his father on his Harley Davidson that will probably pop up in this group as well. Mm-hmm. This is another one of those where I just drive. I'm a lot of people like to create photographs. A lot of people say, are photos made or taken? I'm kind of in between. I just like to go out and find stories, meet people, see what I see, and it's a response, response to the area that I grew up. I kind of view my work as you mentioned earlier, the South is the urban of Atlanta and Chapel Hill and Birmingham, but then there's the rural South, and my focus is really on the rural South, and in particular the Black Belt region of Alabama. And it's a response to home, and I go out and I try to meet people. I love hearing their stories and what they're all about. Friday night football. This was the granddaughter of the lady who was pulling the collard greens. They were growing wild on the side of Highway 14. And I asked her to actually stop and, look at me, but she had some flowers in her hands and was dancing around and just enjoying herself on the side of the road on a beautiful afternoon while her grandmother and great aunt were pulling wild collards on the side of Highway 14 on a toggable. That's the kind of thing that I love. I mean, those are the kind of things that you can't create those stories, and you can't go looking for those stories. You just have to be there. And if you're there, those things present themselves. This kid was at a hunting camp, and I was out driving between Marion and Greensboro and saw them, and they were skinning a freshly shot deer. And they opened their arms, spent about 3 or 4 hours with them, watched them completely skin the deer and take the tenderloins and all the different pieces of meat. And, just loved the picture of him with his dog. The dog really wasn't crazy. I think it was kind of the way he had his hand behind his ear.
So if I could have another sidebar with the audience outside of your hearing, Jerry, I would just say to people to notice the humanity that is so evident in Jerry's work and the way the people so obviously have a sense of trust with him, and the exchange, although this woman is not looking directly at the camera as so many of these subjects are, but there's an exchange between the subject and you, the viewer. Well, certainly between the subject and Jerry, but he gains their confidence and he becomes something like he creates the illusion that he's invisible, but in fact, he's this wonderful humanist photographer behind this camera, bringing us this privileged access to these people we would not otherwise encounter. Okay, you can go back, Jerry. You can keep going.
Okay. Well, I just feel like it's important to connect with people, and the way to do that is you show respect to them. And if you're interested in who they are and what they're doing, then they will give you that respect back. And the best portraits that I think I do, whether it's a corporate portrait or somebody that I meet in the black belt, if you find that respect, they will let their guard down and they will give you who they are. It's not about me as a photographer trying to create the best portrait. I'm trying to create a best portrait for me. I'm trying to create the best image about this person. So it's most important for them to be relaxed and comfortable, and that will come through is the way that I view it. And in a lot of cases, I'm sure he knew I was shooting from down the street, but they're not always as intimate is not the right word, but I'm not always as connected in every portrait. And then there's things like this that tell a different side of the South. Maybe you find this somewhere else. It's Carolina Pride. I don't know if y'all have that in Chapel Hill or.
I'm not sure we do, but I like all the 99-cent offerings.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Christmas morning, it's a great time to be out shooting. I'm usually the only person out on the street.
Right.
Clarence spent a good bit of time talking about his vegetables, talking about his watermelons. And each one of these, it's just it's a quick hello, how are you? And you can immediately tell if people are open. I usually have a camera over my shoulder, but I never lead with the camera. The picture of the little boy, the very first image, I had actually photographed his family once before. And the day that I saw him, I pulled up and just jumped out of the car without a camera. And I always do that first if I can. I like to introduce myself and just let them know who I am, create a conversation, rapport. And then you say, look, I'm a photographer. Do you mind if I take your picture? And I remember, boy, going back to those early black and white days, there was a picture I really wanted to shoot of a man on his front porch who his legs had been cut off at the knees and in his wheelchair. And it's like, how do you approach somebody like that? And after driving back and forth in front of the house, he probably saw me every 3 or 4 minutes, wondering what was going on. I finally pulled over and said, I'm a photographer. I document the South. And at that point, I think it was more of something that I was trying to break the ice. Now I can legitimately get out and talk to people. I've done this long enough with enough record to say, I'm a photographer. I document the South. I work in and around the black belt. And I don't want you to pose for me. I just want you to talk to me and let me snap a few pictures while we chat. And it usually seems to work.
So I will just say in that last picture there, I can actually smell the tobacco products in
yes.
that the photo. It's almost a scratch and sniff photo.
This is one of my favorite images that I've done. I've always liked the image. It also takes me back to a time with my dear friend, Mary Ward Brown, who was a writer in Alabama. And she was the only person that's really loved to ride with me, because when I'm shooting, I'm driving, I'm slamming on brakes, I'm backing up, I'm spinning around, I'm going back. But this was one of our favorite places to go eat. And one of the biggest comments is, wasn't it uncomfortable to sit under all those deers and eat a burger? I guess growing up in the South, I went to so many people's homes who had trophies in their living room that it was pretty normal for me. So I'm late in the afternoon. It's out in Perry County, kind of a standard sort of scene that you might see out in the country with lots of cars and extra chairs. And
So I would just point out, if we could go back to those last two images you showed, which are kind of architectural, certainly have echoes and direct relations back to Walker Evans and certainly other photographers who followed in his footsteps, including William Christianberry and a number of other artists, Stephen Shore, and many other photographers who've come along since. But there's a certain thingness about these images. There's the thing itself is the subject, but it's beautifully presented and it's very artfully presented. But it's this incredible sense of light and moment that's captured by Jerry in this, and it's also this wonderful sort of bookmark or time capsule of architectural history. And this picture here, even though you can see the power lines and some more modern things in the background on the left there, the picture could have been taken in the 1920s, although it would have been as sharp or in color. But anyway, carry on.
this is another one that I really enjoyed. This is another one of those chance connections, driving between Orville and Marion, and saw a couple of guys, galloping through the pasture on their horses, and I was just fascinated, and I kept riding beside them, watching them, and they were looking at me. So I pulled over, got ahead of them, and pulled over, and had a nice conversation about them and how much they ride and what they like to do. And I was just taken by his hand, sitting on the horn of the saddle, and tells its own story in a different way without it telling you exactly who it is.
Mm-hmm. Really evocative image. And then here we have an image that weds at least two of America's favorite pastimes, football and young girls in pastel dresses.
Especially in the South. This is one of a couple of images that have always been kind of, I hate to say fan favorites or sort of iconic images for me, but they've taken on a whole different sort of meaning to a lot of people. Just in the last year or 2 years, they quit wearing the hoop skirts, which some people are for and some are against.
It's also a really interesting contrast because they're obviously on a football field, and that's normally the gridiron where football guys are wearing pads and very brutal to each other, and then here you see these very delicate, fragile-looking young ladies on the field. It's just this wonderful paradox.
The cool thing about it, though, was I ran around after all the homecoming queens and court were presented. I ran to the other side and did a shot of all of them, and they're all pulling up their hoop skirts, and almost every one of them has on either cowboy boots or high-top Converse and striped socks, and it's just such a disconnect from what they are presenting to then show to the crowd who they really are and showing their personal side, which is really kind of cool. I was just drawn to this. I've passed this house for years. I love gray days, gray wintry days in the South is my favorite time to shoot. Christenberry liked to go every August. He'd go back to Tuscaloosa and to Hale County, where he was from, which to me is like, wow, that's the humidity, the fog, not the fog in the air, but from the thickness of the air and the overhead light. It's just a complete contrast, and people think I'm crazy because if it's 47 and overcast or drizzling, I'm running to get to the black belt. This is one of those that I don't know if it's a great photograph, but it's a fun picture, and it tells you something about the South. And this was another one of those little country curb markets, and they serve all the tobacco products, and you can get your moon pies and your RCs. But there's the fishing selection. Over behind here is the plumbing. It's almost like a mini hardware store, and they were having trouble with people stealing the worms.
Well, it makes you wonder. I mean, this is the great thing about some of these images is they have this narrative possibility, and this one begs the question, well, why did they have to put that sign up? Were people stealing worms? I mean, was there a real problem with worm stealing? So
apparently there was.
Yeah, so it's there's a story in that as well.
As opposed to just sort of a metaphor for something, they were actually stealing the worms.
Yeah.
Going back to the architecture, and there's also colors and shapes and lights and darks.
There's also a certain decay that's evident, with the sign that's crooked, and there's age evident in the paint jobs on the building. So there's a sense of time passing and history, and I think that's one of the things again that my colleague Mark Long and I, when we were putting together Southbound, we always asked ourselves, well, what makes a Southern photograph a Southern photograph? Well, there's something about them that there's a quality to many of the images that harkens back to that Faulkner quote that is so often used, the past is never dead, it's not even past. And, it's like this, the South is on some level in images like this, it appears to be frozen in time, although that Pepsi sign is clearly a newer edition.
Right.
It's not an old one, but other than that, again, like the earlier images we were discussing, architectural, they look like they could be from another decade, maybe almost 100 years ago.
They really tend to blend. Occasionally, I still shoot some black and white. And when you see those in black and white, you kind of lose some of that. The colors give away a lot of different things. And it's really hard to, you don't see it as much here in Atlanta when I shoot, but in the South, it's really hard to, tell if this was done in 2022 or 1982.
Was this that same hunting camp?
Same hunting camp.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Phillips. Mm-hmm. He became a good buddy. I, got where whenever I was in that neck of the woods and it was hunting season, I would stop by. Last time I was down that way during the hunting season, they actually let me shoot those the bow and arrows that looked like a gun stock with the bow. Mm-hmm. It was fascinating. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But they're just always as welcome as they can be, offering me whatever they have killed that day. This is the other side of it. Mm-hmm. This is after they've already been hunting. This is back at J&R's where the deer heads were earlier. Passage of time. This is the little rodeo in Marion. They call them mutton busters. She was one of the little kids, and instead of riding bronco, they have sheep. And they throw the kids on the sheep and tell them to hold on. And whoever can hold on the longest wins the trophy. It's really quite entertaining and fun.
I'm sure.
The Central Alabama County Fair in Dallas County and Selma. She was the winner from the previous year, giving out trophies. The part that I really loved, though, was all the 3 and 4 or 5-year-olds, to see them barefoot in their expensive dresses their moms had put them in, and just nervous, sitting in the back waiting to be called.
Love the sly irony in this one, Jerry. On time fashions, very much on time.
And they always seem, and never have gone in and asked them why, but you can buy If you see down on the very bottom on the fashion side, there's a red. They sell I'm not sure of the correct term, like preacher's robes. What do you call that? I don't know the official term.
Cloak. I don't know.
The cloak or the robes, and they sell them in there as well. Typical country scene. Yeah, well, that's one of those beautiful gray days where everything just seems to pop. It wouldn't be the South without religion. I love the structure, the symmetricalness of it all. Again, another wonderful gray day.
Yeah.
These guys were great. I caught them a couple of weekends in a row when I happened to be there more than once. They show up every weekend and argue and gamble playing checkers. This is the dad to the little boy that was the opening picture when you said about riding motorcycles. That's him. He was very proud to show me his motorcycles. This is another one of the images that were in Southbound.
Yeah, and I can just mention a little bit about this. And Mark Long and I were very attracted to this image, and for a lot of reasons, not least of which is the fact that it contains a Confederate flag, but it's also this very self-assured young woman with a rifle, obviously playing some sort of what appears to be some sort of game is it a state fair or something like that?
Yeah.
And so she's very confident there. But the question becomes, what does she think about that Confederate flag in the background? Given certainly now what we know, and after the racial reckoning that we've all gone through, post George Floyd, et cetera. But this was taken well before that. And I think it's interesting to, this is again one of those cases where photographs become a time capsule. And so it's an interesting, this image has a very different read now than it did probably when you took it.
Absolutely. I had a couple of young girls come up to me at a show this was in, and they asked me what kind of statement I was trying to make. And I said, no statement. I was just responding to, excuse me, I was responding to the girl with the gun and the colors, and it's the whole experience of being at the fair with the smell of the cotton candy and the sounds of the rides. And, they asked about the flag, and I said, honestly, when I shot the picture, I wasn't aware of the flag. I never thought, oh, here's a girl with a gun, black girl with a gun with the flag. That never. And I think to your point about what she thought of it, I think at that point in 2009, I don't think she even noticed it either. I think she was just trying to win a teddy bear and knock over the blocks, and that it just shows how quick everything changed with, as you said, racial reckoning, and it became a completely. It was always a favorite image, not just of mine, but wherever I hung shows. But it's taken on a completely different story to it. This guy was on his roof. It looks like it's a little flat, but it was actually the skies were. It was hard to get this to recreate exactly the way I wanted because it was so dark. There was lightning and thunder in the background, and he was standing on his tin roof sweeping off the pine straw and the leaves. And we had a great conversation. He had come to Selma and worked at the Air Force Base and never left. And he wanted, obviously he spends a lot of time alone. He talked to me for about 20 minutes, and all I said is, that's great, huh? But he was fascinating. He talked about flying the jets. He talked about, all the stuff he did at the base. It was, those are the connections, I used to collect a lot of folk art, a really lot of folk art. And I always tell people it's not about collecting a specific piece, although that's what, I wanted. And I was love that piece of work. But as much as when I look at the work, it takes me back to the day that I spent with R.A. Miller, with Mose T, and the stories that came with that. And I always said that I'm more of a collector of stories than I am a collector of art. And I think with my photography, I love taking pictures. I love the process of taking pictures more than I do the process of being the darkroom and all that. But it's the stories that I relate with every image that, resonates with me. And I hope, that when you see a picture like this, you might not know the exact story that I know, but there's a story there that you can tell he's on a roof, he's sweeping, you know what's going on.
And he's not a young man.
He's 83 years old. That's not a young man to be standing on a slippery tin roof in a storm. See lots and lots of trailer parks in Alabama. Hopefully the ones that haven't been hit by all the tornadoes. The light was just perfect this afternoon. Gave it a really nice feel. I call this Venus. This is another place that Mary and I like to go to. Had the best homemade chicken salad. And this particular day, Venus was unclothed. Most of the days that I went there, she'd always say, "Oh, don't you want to take a picture of Venus?" And I'd always take one, but it really wasn't working for me. Dressed in an Auburn jersey or in a fur coat with a hat. It was, for every holiday, it was dressed and all. And we happened to catch it on an off season. This is another one that I kind of refer to is gifts from the photographic gods. I was aware of the tattoo. I didn't know until that night when I was downloading and talking to my wife that is actually the SS, the stormtroopers. This house also had a Confederate flag there. She said, "Boy, I don't know if that was a good idea to be there, but they were as nice as they could be." We talked about football. We talked about shooting guns. We, talked about the weather, Alabama football. But I didn't realize when I was shooting it, I was paying attention to the nipple ring, the knife, the tattoo, unshirt, without a shirt on, and all the tattoos. And under closer examination, when I started printing, I saw the warning, facing right toward the camera. And I'm not sure if I see those things. It's just I've been doing it for so long, they're subliminal. Maybe I saw the Confederate flag. I'm not sure. I've always shot in the South. Whenever I was home, I shot pictures. I guess right after Daddy died in 2000, and right after he died, I found myself in a lull. Didn't know what to do photographically. I was still doing a ton of advertising work, and I bought a panorama camera. And when I went home, that first trip with it, I got, I think, 4 or 5 of my best portfolio images. Just trying to shake things up, and it became something that I really worked a lot with. This is the last image in the group. Not sure why I didn't necessarily plan this to be the last shot. This was a famous Alabamian, well-known Alabamian named W.C. Rice. And he had an environment full of crosses, and I've heard lots of stories, I'm not sure which ones are real, about his family met his wife, but some of his family being killed in a car wreck because there was a car up on the hill with a lot of warnings, sex in hell, hot, hot, hot. And it was and still is a fascinating environment. And he was a really, really interesting man.
He wore a gigantic cross around his own neck. Right?
Yes, I did a portrait of him that was in facing south, and he had one that was, chin to waist, and then 2 other ones. The really fascinating thing was when I went in his house and spent some time with him, talking to him, there were crosses in all the these spigots across the ceiling. That's not the right word. All up and down the walls, but there's also numerology everywhere. I asked him what the correlation was between numerology and the crosses and Jesus, but I'm not sure I got an answer that stuck with me.
Well, like so many things in the South, and this is a wonderful kind of image to end on or to tie things up, because many of the images that you've shown us tonight, Jerry, have a kind of a narrative thread, a narrative that have narrative possibilities, but they're really open-ended, and it's up to the viewer, in a sense, to bring their own sensibility to the image and to complete the story, complete the narrative themselves. And even though the information that you got from Mr. Rice was confusing and conflicting, and there was definitely a story there. And so, and with so many of your other pictures too, sometimes it's a quieter story, or the story's about something different. It could be more about time, or passage of time. It could be more about humanity. But your images are always loaded with this narrative possibility, and that's one of the things that's really drawn me to your work over the years, is that storytelling quality. So you say you like to collect stories. Well, you present them in your photographs.
You can never tell everything from a story. You can never understand it all. But I hope there's enough information there that people get an idea of what it is. And then, like you said, I don't give images titles, because I don't want to change perception or put my perception on it. I believe with photography and in art in general, I put the art out there, and then I let it affect you in the way that it will. I did a painting once, and my uncle who owned a little gallery in Selma, and was a huge collector of Alabama artists. He said, "What's the title?" And I said, "Untitled, #1." He said, "Oh, that's can't do that. You got to give it a title." And he said, "What were you thinking at the time you made this painting?" I said, "Sensing the end." And I can picture him sitting at his desk. He went, no, that's not it at all.
Yeah, you don't get to
determine. I don't give the titles, because I don't want to put that on it where other people look at it and go, "Oh, that's really cool." And they go, "Oh, sensing the end. Oh, yeah, I want the viewer to respond to it however they will."
Yeah. So Iris Dement, I believe, said, "Let the mystery be."
Yes.
Yeah. There's a lot of wisdom in that. Yeah. Well, so Jerry, I guess to ask one final question of you, one of the things, and maybe you could back up 2 or 3 pictures. There's one I'd like to kind of land on while I ask this question. One of the things that I wanted to land on with you and just get your feedback is, what do you, when you think about Southern photography today, and maybe young photographers coming along today, do you have any suggestions, advice? You've already given some hints of how you approach people and that kind of thing, but we touched on, we blazed on the glanced against the idea of the difference in meaning between photographs prior to the national racial reckoning, and I think I would just like to throw it out to you if you have any thoughts about how your approach might change now, or what you think about presenting images that, as a white male photographer, for example, photographing African American subjects, in some cases, what do you feel a different tension now? Do you feel a different acceptance? Do you feel that the situation is different? How, and what would you say to a young photographer approaching it?
I do feel a difference, and I find it a little discouraging in that it hasn't stopped me from shooting and going places, but I'm much more aware. There was a picture that I shot of 3 kids playing basketball on a side yard, and they had a milk crate tacked to the tree. And I got out without thinking, said, "Hey, how y'all doing? Looks like y'all having a great game." Started talking to them about basketball and started taking pictures. And they were fine with it. And I asked them to actually pose for some for me. And then their daughter, not daughter, sister, I guess, or cousin, somebody came off the porch. I photographed them. And I actually ended up going back and talking to the parents and asking for model releases because I really liked the pictures. There are situations now where partially because of racial reckoning, but partially because of just how many photographs in the world, Instagram, social media, and everything else, that people are not trusting. And so my guard is up and I don't stop. I see pictures sometimes that I go, God, that would be a great picture. But if it's a young kid on a sidewalk by himself and I don't see anybody else to stop and say, hey, I'm a photographer, I'd love to shoot some pictures, I keep going because I don't want to get out, engage them, and start taking a few pictures and people coming out going, what are you doing? What's your agenda? Going back to the very beginning when we started, it used to be you were just a kid with the camera, or even if you weren't a kid, but photography wasn't part of the daily dialogue. I'm not finding the right word I want, but it wasn't part of the everyday experience that it is now. So if you were there with taking pictures, people knew that you were a photographer and that, there was a different feeling about photographers than there are now. People taking pictures, maybe photographers is not the right word, but people taking pictures, because so many take pictures and it shows up. They don't know where it's going to show up.
Mm-hmm. Well, the ubiquity of the cell phone camera is just everywhere now. Whereas when you first started, of course, having a camera, even a 35 millimeter camera, much less a medium format, you look like a serious photographer.
Right.
And then now you're an older gentleman with a white beard,
right.
Join the club, but it has a different meaning now, and
it absolutely does.
So for younger people, do you have any thoughts about the emerging photographers today in terms of artists of all stripes, young photographers of color, young photographers of all kinds? Do you have any advice for them about how to approach the world and they're making photographs?
The two things that I say all the time is you have to show respect. It's important to show respect to the people that you want to photograph. If you're shooting a building, you still want to show the respect and not just jump out and start throwing up cameras and people coming out saying, what are you doing? I had a good friend who I was down in the South with, and she jumped out of the car and is in the front yard and going up on the steps. And I said, wait, we need to ask permission. She says, not me. I shoot first and ask for permission later.
I believe I know who that photographer was.
Yeah. And that's one way to go about it. But for me personally, it's all about respecting the people, the place. And if I was going to offer anything to young photographers, is show that respect to whatever the subject is, but also be engaged. I mean, the most important thing to me is I shoot what I love, and I'm being a commercial photographer and I see what other people are doing. It's like, well, I could do that. I know how to do what they're doing. But if I'm not connected to it and feel that need to do it, you got to shoot what you love, and it will come through in your pictures. If you're just shooting something because you think it's popular or that's going to, get some acclaim, it might be a good picture, but it doesn't have the soul to it. It doesn't have the gut to it. And I think it doesn't resonate as much.
Well, I would say that your photographs certainly contain soul, and the respect that you have for your subjects, all of them, is evident in every frame. So, Jerry, I'd like to thank you for taking the time tonight to talk about your work and in the context of Southern photography. And I'd like to thank our hosts tonight for sponsoring this talk. And I do hope that people will have a chance to see your exhibition.
Yeah. Well, thanks. It was a pleasure talking with you, Mark.